Hello, this is John Mark Gray, and we are going to talk about inflation, government debt, and America's weakening financial health here in this video. So let's get started. The federal government usually has expenses that far outstrip incoming revenues in the form of tax receipts, even though they tax everything that breathes, walks, twitches, and many things that don't do any of these rather innocent activities. The government continues to increase their profligate spending without any end in sight, even as their considerable debt obligations, which are largely owed to foreign nations, rise to wholly unsustainable levels. The federal government and Congress cannot pass a balanced budget consistently in this country, but yet have no problems finding and funding forever wars or ridiculous pork projects at the expense of ordinary taxpayers. Moreover, this irresponsible government spending usually correlates highly with the home districts of members of Congress and largely benefits important special interest groups who contribute massively to political campaigns. This corrupt practice has been going on for decades in Washington and is one of many reasons why we can never properly balance a budget in this country. As a result of these poor financial principles in play, the United States of America needs to purposefully create and have inflation in its economic system. This is required in order to make the entire irresponsible money scheme appear to work on some basic level, and through sheer monetary policy wizardry continue to stay afloat for as long as possible, basically, magically kicking the can down the road a little further. The reason for the positive inflation mandate on behalf of central banks is that if you inflate everything in the financial system, from the money supply to the prices of assets, this makes the previous debt that the country borrowed seem smaller in relation to the newest reality of a juiced up and inflated financial system. It is like a sophisticated magic trick where you borrow money in one financial paradigm, and through the genius of central banks and globally equivalent treasury departments around the world waving their magic wands, there is a new financial paradigm created where all financial assets and economic numbers have been inflated to have entirely new values. But you borrowed as a government under the old paradigm. So now as an overall percentage of your debt to incoming revenue or gross domestic product or the value of assets in the new financial paradigm, the debt you borrowed as a percentage is lower in relative terms. This is why the Federal Reserve is always concerned about having positive inflation in the overall economy. These people who work as professional economists in the government are so disingenuous, and this reflects rather poorly on the profession as a whole. The professional economists will have a bunch of other formal reasons why deflation is always bad, but this is all government speak to keep the entire fraud of a money scheme afloat. The government needs inflation, just not so much that the citizens start to notice and complain loudly to the ruling class in Washington. This is why the professional economists target a number around 2% annual inflation, just enough to consistently screw the population, but not high enough to cause a citizen rebellion. In effect, the average consumer is enduring the slow economic death of 1,000 cuts over their miserable lifetime at the powerful hand of big government and severely flawed economic policies. This desperate economic practice is called monetization of the debt. In basic terms, the government cannot control their spending, they borrow heavily, and need to have inflation in order to monetize the debt, so that it is less onerous in future relative terms. The problem is that this is a flawed finance principle on so many levels, and it sure doesn't work if spending increases exponentially and the country borrows more than they can effectively monetize the debt, which is frequently the case with our current big government model. However, this is very bad for consumers on the whole and your average American citizen in helping them stay within a reasonable budget, with the government always needing to create continual and consistent inflation in the economy. In reality, consumers often have to get quite creative with their finances in order to navigate the economic hazards of our perpetual inflation model. The middle class accomplishes this difficult juggling act through utilizing credit cards, taking out equity from their homes, and other even more risky financial measures to keep up with the relentless inflation perpetuated by our poor government policymaking. It is a never-ending cycle, a battle in which ordinary citizens can never win, and ultimately lowers the basic standard of living for all Americans, even the rich, because no one is truly an island in this world. The reasoning here is that living in a castle in the middle of a rapidly deteriorating country makes one essentially a prisoner of circumstances in this rather hellish environment. Many once great cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco are quickly becoming unlivable dystopian nightmares right before our eyes. In other words, lowering the average quality of life for Americans has profound consequences for everyone who participates and contributes money to the failing system. This is the modern theory of finance and economics employed by central banks all over the world and is the primary reason why the middle class is always getting poorer every year. The average person on the planet can never get ahead of the artificially created inflation curve of short-sighted government policies, which inevitably leads to heavy spending, larger budget deficits, and runaway inflation. Let me reiterate this point again. The dirty little secret that nobody admits to, especially corrupt and ethically challenged economists, is that inflation always increases faster than wages and salaries for the majority of Americans. The only group that is largely immune to this phenomenon is the upper echelon of incomes in America. When factoring in the asset inflation benefits, the compounding nature of money itself, and the fact that many of these high-income wage earners often have money working for them earning additional returns, mitigates this inflation dynamic where raises don't keep up with the annual rate of inflation in our economy. This is part of the reason that wealth inequality continues to expand in this country between the upper 5% of wage earners and wealthy Americans as an ever-rising investment class versus the rest of the mainstream workers in the economy who are just trying to make ends meet. The purchasing power of the US dollar is what counts, not the currency itself, which is a relative game as all countries globally are in the same deficit financing boat, borrowing and printing their way into forever sovereign indebtedness. It's the money printing stupid. The real reason that everything is unaffordable in America for the average consumer is all the money printing which has occurred over the last 20 years after the great financial crisis. This money printing was supposed to be temporary to get America back on its feet, but the entire financial system became addicted to this cheap money. And now the financial system will seize up if the money printing is scaled back. So we get the runaway inflation world that we have today. In summing this all up, the Federal Reserve's solution to the great financial crisis, the cure, is far worse than the original disease, and now we are headed towards complete financial ruin as a nation. Yes, the United States of America is that broke. We cannot pay our debt obligations, and will eventually have to reset the entire financial system, officially defaulting on all this unsustainable debt. The big takeaway here is that U.S. Treasuries aren't near as safe as many investors think, including foreign governments. So when the system collapses, this will be a global financial collapse, as the entire system is inextricably linked to America's ballooning national debt problem. The harsh truth is that the future doesn't look good for America on many fronts, with our deteriorating financial system being of primary concern for me as a thoughtful market participant.